In the face of provincial defiance and concerns from industry, the federal government announced today that while it remains committed to a national price on carbon, it is easing off the gas pedal in one area. The government is setting a benchmark for emissions for different sectors. Based on that benchmark, businesses can produce some emissions for free, but go over that benchmark and you have to pay up. Before, the plan was to set the cap at 70%. Now, Ottawa is raising the bar to 80%. In some cases, even 90% for the most vulnerable industries. That means the country's biggest polluters will pay less under the new plan. But remember, this will only apply to provinces the feds decide don't have a suitable plan of their own. Companies will pay $20 per tonne in 2019, and that will rise to $50 per tonne in 2022. The Liberal government is scaling back its plan after hearing concerns from industry.
When big polluters pay, they'll figure out how to reduce their emissions at the most efficient cost. They'll innovate, and that's a really good thing, but we have to do it in a smart way. I've always said the environment and the economy go together, and we don't want to drive industry out of our country. We want to have the most energy efficient, smart industries here that create good jobs, at the same time do what we need to do to tackle emissions, and that's exactly what we're doing.
Saskatchewan is one of the strongest opponents of the national price on carbon and has launched a legal challenge against it. Ontario plans to join that lawsuit. So does this concession change anything? Joining me now from Saskatoon is the Premier of Saskatchewan, Scott Moe. Welcome to the program, Premier. Now, you tweeted today that the federal government's change is a watering down of the carbon plan. We know that you're not crazy about the federal government's carbon pricing plan. So are you happy about that?
Well, what we're seeing today is an admission that this does actually affect the economy. And, you know, over the last couple of years, we've seen the federal government bolstered by groups such as the Ecofiscal Commission and others say that the carbon tax, this Made in Ottawa carbon tax, will not have an effect on the Canadian or the Saskatchewan economy. We've put forward that simply isn't the case. The effect
I'd like to stop you there, Premier, because
yes.
I have a statement from the Environment Minister dating back to January when they first announced these targets, and she explicitly says that they want to limit the potential impacts of carbon pricing on international competitiveness. So it seems to me they've been acknowledging for some time that this will have an impact on competitiveness. It's just about managing that impact.
Well, then they should do a full study on it, like Premier Wall had asked a couple of years ago. And to my knowledge, that study on the economic impact of our Canadian and Saskatchewan economy has not been done, or most certainly, if it has been done, the results of it have not been released to the Canadian people. You see the people in Canada now starting to vote with their feet and starting to identify that this is a flawed policy. This carbon tax policy does not have any substantial environmental outcomes, but it does have severe impacts to our economy. And you're seeing the federal government starting to admit that truly is the case here today.
You talk about wanting to see a full study. You say it doesn't work. I would note that groups like, for instance, the World Bank, which is hardly a largely left-leaning organization, say that carbon pricing is effective. The OECD says similar things. Plenty of economists that would share that view. But do you feel that there is some evidence that could be put in front of you at this point that would convince you that this is a good idea? Because it sounds like your mind's made up.
It is made up. We had
regardless of any evidence.
But there is evidence. The University of Regina has put forward a study where carbon tax in our province would have less than a 1% impact on emissions and close to a $2 billion impact on our Saskatchewan economy. That's valid evidence, and that is, I think, speaks to where we were with the Vancouver Declaration in ensuring that each province's economy is different, so each province's plan that they put forward on how to minimize the impact and maximize the environmental outcomes will be different across the nation. It was identified when the first ministers met, including the Prime Minister, and it should be adhered to today.
I want to come back to what is happening today, what we're hearing from the federal government about this idea of softening a little bit of the impact on business. Do you consider this a victory of any sort?
Oh, no, this flawed policy needs to disappear. We need to go back to the agreements that the First Ministers had. We have a credible plan in Saskatchewan. I know there's other provinces that have a credible plan in Atlantic Canada that don't meet the federal backstop, because the federal backstop, quite frankly does not work, as it is a flawed policy. But we have a credible plan, and the federal government has an opportunity now to go the rest of the way, engage with provinces in Atlantic Canada, the province of Ontario, the province of Saskatchewan, on how we can move forward, limiting greatly our impact to the industries and jobs and families across the nation, and maximizing our environmental outcomes, as opposed to this made in Ottawa, one-size-fits-all carbon tax solution that they have come up with that did not come up with in any agreement with provinces. It was imposed on us, I might add, by the Prime Minister in October of 2016.
Now, I can appreciate why, given your point of view, you would say you'd like them to just flush the whole thing. But realistically, I mean, I certainly can't imagine a world where that's going to happen. Just today, we have a statement from Minister McKenna that she sent out to various media outlets in which she says, we can't afford to let big polluters off the hook. Unlike the Conservatives, we believe that big polluters should pay. And then again, she talks about this, trying to strike this balance of limiting emissions, but also staying competitive. What is your best case scenario here? Because the idea that Ottawa is going to back off entirely, there's been absolutely no indication that that's going to happen.
Well, watered-down poison is still poison. A friend of mine told me that here this morning. But the fact of the matter is here we see the federal government watering down the impact to our large emitters, to our major corporations in the nation, but not watering down in any way the impact to families. Families are still going to pay the full cost of this tax, this broad-based tax that the federal government is trying to impose. It is not a strong policy. It hasn't worked in other areas. It won't work in Canada. This is a missed opportunity by the federal government, and I would urge them to reconsider backing up this policy and re-engaging with provinces across the nation with the credible plans that have been put forward.
Now, your federal counterpart, Andrew Scheer, is preparing to release his environmental plan to curb emissions. We haven't seen it yet, but he's been talking about it and building up anticipation. What do you want to hear from your federal counterparts? You obviously don't like what the Liberals are doing, but what could the federal Conservatives do that could be a pan-Canadian plan and still make you happy?
Well, truly, the first would be to have collaboration with the provinces, not just talk about it. It started with collaboration under the current administration, but it very quickly moved away from that to an imposed carbon tax, or an attempted imposed carbon tax on the province. Second, what Saskatchewan and Canada have to offer the world is innovation and knowledge that we have in industries such as agriculture, such as mining, such as manufacturing, and that will make a true impact to reducing emissions within the borders of Saskatchewan, but by exporting knowledge such as carbon capture and storage, such as zero-till agriculture to other areas of the world, and we're doing that actively now, we can truly have an impact on what is a global challenge, climate change, far beyond the borders of Saskatchewan or the nation of Canada. This is what our nation has to offer, and this is the opportunity that we are sadly missing by talking about taxing our Canadian industries and families.
When it comes to your fight with the federal government, you, of course, have that court reference that Ontario has agreed to support you on. Do you know whether or not that issue will be resolved before the federal government intends to start imposing this tax on provinces that won't play ball, essentially, or won't play by the federal government's rules?
I would be hopeful that we would resolve that sooner rather than later. We're looking for a positive outcome from the reference case that we have put in front of the Saskatchewan Court of Appeal. We now see Ontario intervening in that particular case. And
but you're not sure?
I'm not sure of the timelines, but we are looking for a favorable outcome.
As one would imagine, certainly you would want it to work out in your favor, but I just wonder, can you be sure that this thing will have wound its way through the courts before the federal government forces a price on you? Because it doesn't seem like there's much middle ground right now.
There isn't any middle ground unless we see the federal government further their watering down of this flawed policy and re-engaging in what they committed to at the outset of this effort, and that is a collaborative effort with the provinces, recognizing that our plans will be different across this very diverse nation. Again, Canada is a diverse place from coast to coast to coast. That diversity is our strength. In no way should a one-size-fits-all carbon tax policy out of Ottawa be beneficial for all corners of our great nation. Diversity
is our strength. There is something you agree with Justin Trudeau on. We're going to have to leave it there, so we're out of time. But thank you very much for coming on the program today. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe.
Appreciate it, Catherine.
So, is this a significant clawback of Ottawa's carbon price, or a small tweak? And where does it put Canada on its path to meeting international emissions targets? Joining me now via Skype, Chris Regan is the chair of Canada's Eco-Fiscal Commission. So, Chris Regan, some people are saying this is a watering down of the carbon pricing plan. Is that accurate?
I would not use that term. I think what we've got here is a pretty small adjustment in the federal, what is often called the federal backstop plan. And it's a small adjustment that really is driven by concerns about business competitiveness And I think those concerns are quite legitimate, and we've been talking about them for some time. It is true that some of those emissions-intensive and trade-exposed businesses like cement and fertilizer and steel production and petrochemicals, they are the ones that are really being talked about today, and they're going to now find that the carbon pricing system, as defined by the federal policy, is just a little bit easier to deal with. They still will face a carbon price. They'll still have incentives to reduce emissions, but their profitability will be buoyed up a little bit more than it would have been, and that's good.
Okay, you're acknowledging it will affect competitiveness. The extension of the argument from particularly a lot of conservatives that we're hearing from today is that means that the federal government shouldn't be going ahead with this, because if it's going to hurt competitiveness, it is going to, I've seen people say it's going to hurt families, it's going to kill jobs. What do you respond to that?
Well, I think the challenge in carbon pricing is to put a carbon price in place so that we reduce emissions, because that's the primary objective here. But at the same time, you want to be very mindful of the impact on competitiveness. And I think it's true that the federal government has actually been quite mindful of that. And I guess my position at the Ecofiscal Commission, our position is that you can design a carbon pricing system that does both things, that actually gives businesses the incentive to reduce their emissions, but also doesn't actually threaten their competitiveness. And that's exactly what this output-based pricing system is designed to do.
How will this particular move, or to what extent will it affect Canada's ability to reach the targets set out in the Paris Agreement?
Well, we're in a situation right now where the policies that are currently in place or about to be put in place in the next few months are still not enough to get us to our commitments made in Paris, which is something like a 30% reduction below 2005 levels by 2030. What we need to achieve those targets are to have all of the country have a sensible carbon pricing system in place, and then to ramp up that carbon price well beyond today's level. So I think this change today is largely irrelevant in terms of achieving those 2030 targets. We've got to do much more anyway.
Thank you very much for your time, Chris Reagan.